Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Abdul Nasir Jangda from Qalam Institute and MASICNA based in Dallas, Texas. I wanted to share a message with everyone today about developing the spirituality of our youth, our younger generation. The fact of the matter is that in the current global culture that we have, specifically here in North America, with all the different unique challenges that are present for youth today, we're dealing with a very serious situation when it comes to spirituality. And the problem is manifesting itself in a number of different forms, from questions about faith altogether, abandoning, leaving the religion altogether, to a crisis of faith, to disenfranchisement or disenchantment with the community, becoming disconnected from the Muslim community. It's manifesting itself in all these very problematic forms. And I think the problem is something that's very well known. We've all seen, we've all heard, we've maybe even experienced some of these horror stories. But I'd like to dedicate the few minutes that we're going to be sharing today, I'd like to dedicate them to the solution. How do we implement a solution? So I have there are just some experiences based off of thought and experiences. I have some very specific ideas on this issue. Number one is that in Islam, we have a great emphasis on education. Ta'aleem, ta'allum, ilm. There's a great emphasis on knowledge and education. And because of that emphasis on education, we usually are very motivated. Most of our activities, most of our resources, our organizations are geared towards educating people in general, but particularly educating our youth. While that's not a bad thing, but we have to understand that there is a process. If we go back to the source itself, the verse of the Quran, the ayah in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the job description, the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, the mission, the job, the task of the Prophet ﷺ is to first and foremost, يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ, to recite upon them the miraculous signs of God, which means to motivate them, to inspire them, to enrich their lives. Get them to think, kind of broaden their horizons, if you will. Number two, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, then purify them. Teach them a very practical form of spirituality. Slowly kind of bring them into a regular spiritual regimen and practice. وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, and then the third step is education. We've got this process backwards. From the very get-go, from the very beginning, whether it be Islamic school or it be Sunday school or youth groups or masjid halaqas, we are pushing education. We want to take a textbook, we want to sit down, we want them to memorize a bunch of surahs, and we want to do all of this. And I want to reiterate, those things are important and they are necessary, but they are the third step in the process. We need to get back to focusing on motivation, inspiration, enrichment. Inspire people, motivate people. I'll give you the ultimate example of this, the Friday khutbah. The Friday khutbah is, of course, there is something that you learn, no doubt. But the Friday sermon, the Jumu'ah khutbah, is not there for education. It's not a class, it's not a seminar. It's meant to inspire, it's meant to motivate, to lift up their spirits, to prepare them to go out there and to live a spiritually healthy life in the real world. So that's the objective. So when we talk about spiritual development of our youth, of our children, I'd like to emphasize, and this is something I've implemented in my own community, my own students that we train at the Qalam Seminary, at the MASICNA Institute program, the students that I train that are youth directors and imams in different communities, this is exactly what we teach them to implement with youth. And that is motivate them, inspire them, lift their spirits, enrich their lives, and then they will present themselves to be educated. And so if I can, I'll get a little bit more tangible. What an ideal youth program in a community should look like. And again, this is something that I implemented myself 15 years ago in my community. This is something that I continue to teach my students who serve as youth directors and imams who primarily work with youth across the country. And that is, I always instruct them, I teach them to have a 3-tiered program. The youth program needs to be a 3-tiered program. Number one is the broadest level. Think of a big circle. It's like a funnel approach. So the big wide opening is social activity. Create social activities. And that is where the majority of your youth will come. So basically, I would venture to say 70% of the time, the energy, the resources should be dedicated to having social activities. Good, spiritually healthy social activities that put them in good company. Of course, when prayer time comes, they pray. There's a good message, there's good company. But it's not very heavy in the sense of a lecture. It's just good, fun, social activity, which, if you think about it, it provides the alternative, the Islamic alternative, the halal alternative. So that's the first thing, social activities. Then 20% of the energy, the time, the resources needs to be dedicated to basic motivation, inspiration, and enrichment, like a weekly halaqah series where they talk about modern day issues. They can go through the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the seerah. They can go through basic Quranic discussions that are relevant to their lives. And then that's the smaller circle inside of the larger circle. Well, where if you have 100 kids, 100 youth participating in the social activities, you'll have maybe about 50 or 60 of them coming to this weekly motivational, inspirational session. Then the smallest circle inside is education. And 10% of the time, the energy, the resources initially should be invested into those educational programs and activities that are an actual tangible class, learning Arabic, memorizing some Quran, learning some hadith, learning some basic fiqh, right? And that can occur once or twice a week, whatever the students are capable of. And if you have 100 students in the social activity, you have 50, 60 students coming to the motivational session, the weekly, halaqah, you'll maybe have 10 or 15 of them coming to the actual class. But if we start building like this, the numbers continue to increase. And it will always remain a funnel. You have to understand that it will always remain a funnel. But the numbers will increase, and that's when we'll be able to add more resources, and then we can invest more resources into education as they're ready to learn more and go forward. But that funnel should always be in place. That's just a brief little just some thoughts, some ideas, a strategy that I personally have used and implemented for engaging our youth spiritually. We have the task of not only preserving and maintaining, but also building their faith. And this is how I see that it's very practical and it's very doable. Remember one thing, there's a little catchphrase I share with my students, and that is practical spirituality. Teach spirituality, but teach it in a very practical form. Something they can live, something that is living and breathing, that can be a part of their everyday lives. So inshallah, if we're able to do this, go back to, this is actually the philosophy of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. The companions were called the companions, Sahaba, because they were in the suhbah of the Prophet ﷺ. They accompanied him, they spent time with him. And then he motivated them through the khutbah and the other occasional talks and discussions. And then there were some that he taught at the next level. So if we can go back to that original model, I think we'll be able to really take great strides in solving a lot of the spiritual crisis that is occurring in our communities. And this is something that needs to be processed by teachers, by parents, by communities and organizations. I pray and I hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to be a means of preserving the faith of our future generations. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects us from being the means of destroying the faith of the future generations because of our own negligence or our lack of strategy. And I pray and I hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserves the iman of all of our children and all of our youth. We have great hopes and aspirations, and we should have nothing but great hopes and aspirations, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward our hope within the future generations. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you very much for watching. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.